Alarms tore through my ship before I even opened my eyes. I am Kestrick Van, scout pilot of the Dralic Ascendancy, and the noise ringing through my cockpit meant only one thing. Something had found me. I had crossed into the marked zone less than 6 minutes earlier, a patch of space the humans called their border, a patch of space my superiors called a bluff. My hands moved across the controls before my mind had even caught up with the danger. Every sensor on my small scout ship was screaming that something massive stood behind me, yet my rear cameras showed nothing but empty stars. I want to explain how I ended up here, drifting alone at the edge of unclaimed space, with my heart pounding against my ribs. 3 days earlier, the Ninth Armada received a transmission unlike anything we had intercepted before. It was short. It was calm. It said that the region ahead belonged to a species called humans, and that any vessel crossing the marked line would not be given a second warning. My commanding officer, Fleet Admiral Threx Orun, read the message aloud to the bridge crew and laughed so hard that his second cracked a smile out of nervous habit. We had scanned this region for cycles. There was no shipyard, no visible military presence, not even a listening post that our instruments could detect. Just a marker beacon repeating the same message on a loop, over and over, patient as stone. Threx ordered a single scout ship forward to test the claim before committing the fleet. I volunteered, partly out of pride, and partly because I did not believe the warning either. In my years of service, I had crossed dozens of contested borders. Every species we encountered postured before they fought, filled space with propaganda and empty threats designed to buy time. I assumed humans were no different. I assumed wrong, and the alarms screaming through my cockpit were the first proof of it. I checked my instruments again. No visible ships, no weapons fire, no debris, and yet my proximity sensor insisted that an object with a mass larger than my own vessel sat less than 200 meters off my starboard side. I rotated my exterior camera toward the reading. Nothing but stars and the faint blue smear of a distant nebula. My throat tightened. In all my years flying reconnaissance, I had never encountered a sensor ghost this persistent. Ghosts flicker, ghosts fade. This one held steady, as if daring me to look harder. I broke off my approach and reverse thrust, intending to retreat back toward the fleet with whatever data I could salvage. That was when my ship shuddered, not from an impact, but from something far stranger. My engines cut out completely. Not damaged, not disabled by an external strike, simply off, as though someone had reached into my systems and flipped a switch I did not know existed. I toggled the ignition sequence. Nothing responded. My cockpit lights flickered once, then steadied, and a low hum settled into the hull, a hum that did not belong to any system on my ship. I sat there in silence, drifting, powerless, staring out at a starfield that offered no answers. For a long moment I convinced myself this was a malfunction, an unfortunate coincidence born from crossing into an unfamiliar sector. Then a voice came through my cockpit speaker, translated instantly into my own language despite my communications array being completely dark on the display in front of me. The voice was calm, almost gentle, and it said only this: "You were told not to come here." I demanded to know who was speaking. I demanded they show themselves. Silence answered me, the kind of silence that feels heavier than any sound. My scanners still detected the mass beside me, unmoving, patient, and I understood in that moment that whatever watched me had no interest in destroying my ship. It wanted me to leave, and it wanted me to understand exactly why. Power returned to my engines as suddenly as it had vanished. My controls lit up. My ship responded to my hands again as though nothing had happened. I did not wait for a second demonstration. I turned my scout vessel around and burned every reserve of fuel I had to put distance between myself and that patch of empty watching space. By the time I reached the edge of the Ninth Armada's formation, my hands were still shaking on the controls. I requested immediate audience with Admiral Threx, and I was brought to the command deck within minutes, my scout data already streaming to the main display. Threx watched the recording of my encounter with narrowed eyes, arms crossed over his broad chest, unmoved by the fear still evident in my voice as I gave my report. When the recording ended, he turned to his senior officers and dismissed the entire incident as an elaborate trick, a cloaking technology paired with a recorded voice designed to frighten scouts away from a border the humans could not actually defend. I tried to argue. I told him that no cloaking field I had ever encountered could shut down a ship's engines from the outside, without a single trace of an energy signature. I told him the voice had responded to my actions in real time, meaning something intelligent had been watching me the entire duration of my approach. Threx waved away my concerns with the confidence of a commander who had never lost a fleet in his 3 centuries of service. He believed the humans were bluffing with theatrics because they lacked the numbers to back up their claim. He believed wrong, and I was the only person on that bridge who seemed to sense it. That night, alone in my quarters, I reviewed my scout data over and over, searching for any detail I might have missed. My sensors had picked up nothing conclusive, no hull shape, no engine signature, no weapon system I could classify. Whatever had disabled my ship left no fingerprint behind, as if it wanted to remain a mystery on purpose, a warning wrapped inside an unknown. I began to understand that this was not a bluff built from confidence and empty words. This was a demonstration, carefully controlled, deliberately restrained. They could have destroyed me. They chose not to. And somehow, that restraint frightened me more than any show of force could have. The following morning, Fleet Admiral Threx called an assembly of the entire command staff. He announced that the 9th Armada would advance into the marked territory at first light, all 42 vessels moving together in a display of strength meant to answer the humans' warning with one of our own. I watched the officers around me nod in agreement, eager for a fight they assumed would be short and one-sided. I alone felt a cold weight settle into my chest, a feeling I could not shake no matter how many times I told myself I was simply rattled from my encounter. I requested permission to speak privately with Threx before the fleet departed. He granted it, more out of formality than genuine interest in my concerns. I stood before him in his private quarters and explained again what I had experienced, emphasizing the complete absence of any detectable technology behind the disabling of my ship. I told him that any species capable of disarming a vessel without firing a single shot was a species we could not afford to underestimate. Threx listened patiently, then placed a hand on my shoulder in a gesture meant to be reassuring. He told me that fear was a natural response to the unknown, but that the Ascendancy had encountered unknown threats 1,000 times before, and had always found a way to overcome them through strength of numbers and superior firepower. He believed technology alone could not stop an armada of our size, no matter how advanced it appeared. He believed that whatever watched me in that empty stretch of space was simply an isolated outpost, a single vessel, equipped with experimental countermeasures, nothing more. I left his quarters unconvinced, carrying a dread I could not put into words, a dread that would prove justified far sooner than I wanted. At dawn, by fleet reckoning, the 9th Armada crossed the marked boundary in full formation. I flew near the rear of the fleet in my repaired scout ship, ordered to maintain a defensive position and report anything unusual. The moment we crossed the line, I felt the same electric tension I had felt during my solo approach, a stillness in the space around us that made every instrument reading feel like it was holding its breath. Nothing happened immediately. No alarms, no disabled engines, no voice through the comms. For the first hour, I began to wonder if perhaps Threx had been right after all, if my encounter had been an isolated incident rather than the opening move of something far larger. Then, exactly 1 hour and 12 minutes after crossing the boundary, one of our outer scout ships stopped transmitting. Not destroyed, not damaged, simply silent, its telemetry cutting out mid-sentence, as though someone had reached out and turned it off. The bridge crew assumed a communications failure at first, a common enough occurrence during long-range operations. A second scout ship went silent 4 minutes later, then a third. Threx ordered the fleet to slow its advance and dispatch a support vessel to investigate the last known position of the missing ships. I watched from my station as the support vessel approached the coordinates, its sensors sweeping the empty space where 3 ships should have been. There was nothing there, no wreckage, no debris field, no distress beacon, no trace that 3 vessels carrying dozens of crew members had ever existed in that patch of space at all. The support vessel's captain reported the anomaly with visible confusion in his voice, unable to explain how 3 ships could simply cease to exist without leaving behind so much as a scorch mark on the surrounding stars. Threx's confidence, for the first time since I had known him, wavered. I watched it happen on his face, a flicker of doubt crossing features that had never shown uncertainty in all my years serving under his command. He ordered the fleet to halt entirely and hold position while he consulted with his senior staff. I stood near the back of the command deck, listening to officers debate theories that grew increasingly desperate as each one failed to account for what we had witnessed. Some suggested a cloaking field capable of not just hiding ships, but erasing them from existence entirely, a technology none of us had ever encountered or even theorized about in our centuries of galactic exploration. Others suggested sabotage, though no explanation could account for how 3 separate vessels might be compromised simultaneously without any warning signs. I said nothing during the debate, though my mind kept returning to the voice that had spoken through my cockpit speaker days earlier. "You were told not to come here." It had not been a threat delivered in anger. It had been a simple statement of fact, delivered with the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly what would happen next and felt no need to raise their voice about it. I began to suspect that the disappearance of our scout ships was not an attack in the way we understood attacks. It was something closer to a demonstration, a continuation of the same restrained power I had witnessed alone in that empty stretch of space. Threx eventually ordered the fleet to resume its advance, though with visibly reduced confidence. He redistributed our formation, pulling the remaining scout ships closer to the main body of the armada for protection, a decision that felt more like an admission of fear than a tactical adjustment. I found myself assigned to fly directly alongside the flagship, close enough to hear the tension in the voices of the bridge crew, through the open comm channel between our vessels. For the next several hours, nothing happened. The fleet advanced in cautious silence, every officer aboard every ship watching their instruments, with the kind of intensity usually reserved for active combat, even though no enemy had shown itself. I used the quiet hours to review historical records from the Ascendancy's archives, searching for any documented encounter that might resemble what we were experiencing. I found nothing. Every first contact scenario in our extensive records involved some form of visible confrontation, ships appearing on sensors, weapons fire exchanged, communications established or refused. Nothing in our history matched an enemy capable of disabling and erasing vessels without ever revealing themselves, without ever engaging in the kind of direct confrontation that defined every conflict the Ascendancy had ever fought. We were entering territory, both literal and metaphorical, that none of our doctrine had prepared us for. As the hours stretched on, I noticed something strange in my own sensor readings, a pattern I almost dismissed as instrument error, before realizing it repeated with too much consistency to be random. Every so often, for fractions of a second, my scanners registered a mass, far larger than anything in our fleet, positioned just beyond the edge of our formation, gone before I could fully process the reading. I reported this to the flagship immediately, and within minutes, 3 other scout pilots confirmed similar readings from their own positions, each catching brief glimpses of something vast moving alongside us, always vanishing before any weapons system could lock onto it. Threx ordered all ships to fire on any confirmed contact, however brief. For the next 20 minutes, the fleet's defensive batteries lit up the darkness around us, energy weapons discharging at phantom readings that vanished before impact every single time. I watched the display on my console fill with false positives and wasted ordnance, the fleet burning through its defensive reserves against an enemy that refused to hold still long enough to be struck. It felt less like combat and more like swatting at shadows, and the growing frustration among the crew was audible, even through the static of our comm channels. Then, as suddenly as it began, the phantom readings stopped. The sensors fell silent. No masses, no ghosts, no fleeting glimpses of something vast moving among us. The fleet held its formation in uneasy quiet, every officer aboard every vessel waiting for the next development, unsure whether the silence meant safety or simply a pause before something worse arrived. I remember staring out at the stars through my cockpit window, searching for any sign of movement, any indication of what watched us from the darkness. I found nothing, and somehow that emptiness felt more threatening than any visible threat could have. Admiral Threx called another assembly of his senior staff, and this time I was invited to attend despite my relatively junior rank, a decision that told me more about the growing desperation aboard the flagship than any official statement could have. The officers debated retreat, weighing the loss of 3 scout ships and significant ordnance against the potential cost of continuing forward into unknown danger. Threx listened to every argument with the same grim expression he had worn since the first ships went silent, and when the debate finally quieted, he made his decision. The Ninth Armada would continue its advance, deeper into the marked territory, in search of whatever force had claimed this region as its own. I left that meeting with the same dread I had carried since my first encounter, a certainty growing stronger with every passing hour that we had stumbled into something far beyond our understanding, something patient and controlled, and utterly unlike any enemy the Ascendancy had faced before. As I returned to my scout ship and prepared for the fleet's continued advance, I found myself thinking again of that calm voice through my cockpit speaker, the simple statement that had felt less like a threat and more like a promise. We had been warned once. We had chosen not to listen. And somewhere in the darkness ahead of us, patient and watching, something waited to see what we would do next. I did not sleep that night, if the artificial cycle of ship time could even be called night anymore. I sat in my cockpit long after my shift ended, running the same sensor logs over and over, hoping to find some detail that might explain what we were facing. I found nothing new, only the same brief, fleeting glimpses of something vast and unidentifiable, moving just beyond the edge of our perception. Whatever waited for us in the dark ahead had shown remarkable restraint so far, choosing to disable and confuse, rather than destroy outright. I could not decide whether that restraint offered any comfort at all, or whether it simply meant the worst was still to come. The fleet resumed its advance at first light, though the word light meant little in a region of space where no sun burned close enough to warm our hulls. I flew my scout ship in tight formation with the others, closer to the main body of the Armada than protocol usually allowed, seeking whatever small comfort proximity to larger ships might offer. Admiral Threx ordered increased sensor sweeps across every frequency our instruments could register, determined to catch whatever had been toying with us the day before. For the first several hours, the sweeps returned nothing but empty space, and the distant glow of stars too far away to matter. I spent those quiet hours studying the readings from our missing scout ships one final time, searching for any pattern I might have overlooked. The data told a strange story if I looked at it the right way. Each ship had gone silent within seconds of a brief energy spike registering on its internal systems, a spike too small to indicate a weapon of any kind, closer to the signature of a scanning pulse than an attack. It occurred to me that perhaps our ships had not been destroyed at all. Perhaps they had been captured, studied, examined by whatever force controlled this region, and the absence of wreckage was not evidence of destruction, but evidence of removal. I shared this theory with the flagship's tactical officer, a sharp-minded woman named Vesa Orim, who had served alongside Threx for over a century. She listened carefully, then admitted she had reached a similar conclusion independently, though neither of us could offer proof beyond circumstantial reasoning. The fleet pressed onward through a stretch of space unremarkable in every visible way. Ordinary stars scattered across an ordinary black canvas, nothing to suggest we traveled through territory claimed and defended by an unseen power. That ordinariness became its own kind of tension, a silence so complete that every officer aboard every ship seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the moment it would break. I found myself glancing at my sensor display every few seconds, unable to relax, even during the quietest stretches of our journey. My nerves stretched thin from the accumulated weight of everything we had witnessed so far. 6 hours into our renewed advance, the silence finally broke. A transport vessel near the rear of our formation, tasked with carrying supplies and reserve personnel, suddenly reported a hull breach on its lower decks. The captain's voice came through the fleet-wide comm channel edged with confusion rather than panic, explaining that no impact had registered on any of the ship's external sensors, yet a section of the hull had simply opened, as though peeled back by some force that left no trace of its passage. Emergency crews rushed to seal the breach, and for several tense minutes, the fleet held position while damage control teams assessed the situation. I listened to the reports coming through the comm channel with growing unease. The breach had not been caused by any weapon our sensors could detect. No energy discharge, no kinetic impact, nothing beyond the simple fact that a section of reinforced hull plating had ceased to exist for a period of roughly 4 seconds before reappearing exactly as it had been, minus the crew members who had been standing in that section when it happened. 3 crew members were gone, not injured, not killed in any conventional sense that damage control could identify, simply gone, along with the section of hull that had briefly vanished around them. The bridge crew of the flagship fell into stunned silence as this report filtered through the command channel. I could hear Admiral Threx's voice shaking slightly as he demanded clarification from the transport's captain, a request that yielded no new information, because the captain himself could offer no explanation for what his own crew had witnessed. Whatever force operated in this region did not follow the rules of engagement that governed every conflict I had ever studied or participated in. It did not fire weapons in any conventional sense. It simply reached into the fabric of our ships and removed whatever it chose to remove, leaving behind confusion and fear in place of wreckage and casualties we could properly mourn. I requested permission to launch an auxiliary sensor drone, a small unmanned probe capable of gathering data from a safer distance than my own scout ship could achieve. Threx granted the request without hesitation, eager for any additional information that might help explain what we were facing. I launched the drone from my ship's underside and guided it toward the outer edge of our formation, programming it to record continuously across every sensor band available to it. For the next several hours, the drone drifted alongside the fleet, gathering data that streamed directly to my console in an unbroken feed. Most of what the drone captured mirrored what our other instruments had already shown: empty space punctuated by the occasional phantom reading that vanished before it could be properly analyzed. But roughly 2 hours into its deployment, the drone captured something different, a fleeting visual distortion near the edge of its camera range, a shape too brief and too indistinct to identify with certainty, yet undeniably present in a way our sensor ghosts had never been. I replayed the footage a dozen times, slowing it down frame by frame, trying to extract more detail from the blurred edges of whatever had passed close enough to the drone to register on its cameras. What I saw defied easy description. The shape was vast, easily larger than our flagship, with angles and proportions that seemed to shift depending on the angle of observation, as though the vessel itself resisted being fully perceived. I forwarded the footage immediately to the flagship, and within minutes, every senior officer aboard every vessel in the fleet had reviewed the same brief clip. The reaction was immediate and unanimous. Whatever we faced was not a myth, not an exaggeration born from frightened imaginations. It was real, it was massive, and it had been moving alongside our fleet for longer than any of us wanted to consider. Admiral Threx called an emergency assembly, and this time there was no debate about whether to continue forward. The only question was how. Some officers argued for an immediate retreat, citing the loss of 3 scout ships and 3 crew members as sufficient evidence that we faced a threat beyond our current capabilities. Others argued that retreat now would only invite pursuit, that our best chance of survival lay in pushing forward quickly enough to locate and confront whatever controlled this territory, before it could pick apart our fleet piece by piece. Threx listened to both sides with the weary expression of a commander who had never faced a decision this difficult in all his centuries of service. In the end, he chose a middle path, ordering the fleet to tighten its formation into a defensive cluster, while continuing forward at reduced speed, prioritizing caution over the aggressive advance he had originally planned. I returned to my scout ship feeling no more reassured by this decision than I had by any other development of the past 2 days, though I understood the logic behind it. There was no clear path to safety anymore, only degrees of risk, and every officer aboard the Ninth Armada seemed to sense that the choices ahead of us would only grow more difficult as we ventured deeper into contested space. As the fleet resumed its cautious advance, I found myself reflecting on the nature of the enemy we faced, if enemy was even the right word for a force that had shown such deliberate restraint. 3 ships lost, 3 crew members taken. A handful of sensor ghosts and phantom readings that never resolved into anything our weapons could target. For a fleet of 42 vessels, these losses were minor, almost negligible by the standards of any conflict I had studied in the Ascendancy's long history. And yet the psychological toll aboard every ship in our formation had grown far beyond what those small losses should have warranted, a testament to how deeply unsettling it was to face an enemy that refused to reveal itself in any conventional way. I thought back to the voice that had spoken through my cockpit speaker during my initial encounter, calm and measured, delivering its warning without anger or malice.
"You were told not to come here!"
It occurred to me that everything happening to our fleet might simply be the continuation of that same message, delivered not through words this time, but through demonstration, a patient and deliberate effort to convince us to turn back, before matters escalated beyond the point of no return. I began to wonder whether the humans, if humans truly controlled this territory, were offering us a final chance to withdraw, a chance our pride and our orders prevented us from taking. I shared this theory with Vesa Oram during a brief comm exchange later that shift, and she considered it carefully before responding. She agreed that the pattern of our losses suggested restraint rather than aggression, but she pointed out a troubling implication buried within that restraint. If this level of demonstrated power represented genuine caution on the part of our unseen enemy, then whatever lay beyond this restraint, whatever they were capable of unleashing if provoked further, might exceed anything the Ascendancy had ever encountered in its long history of expansion and conquest. Her words settled into my chest like a stone, and I found myself unable to shake the feeling that we were standing at the edge of something far larger than a border dispute, something that would define the fate of our entire fleet, regardless of the choices we made from this point forward. The fleet continued its advance through the following hours, in a state of tense, watchful silence. Every sensor operator aboard every ship maintained constant vigilance, scanning for any sign of the vast shapes our drone had briefly captured, any indication of the phantom readings that had plagued us since crossing the border. For a while, nothing appeared. The stars stretched on around us, indifferent to our fear, and I began to wonder if perhaps we had passed through the worst of it, if whatever force controlled this territory had made its point and would now allow us to proceed unmolested. That hope shattered when a support cruiser near the center of our formation reported a total systems failure, every console going dark simultaneously despite full power reserves and no detected external interference. The crew aboard that vessel drifted helplessly for nearly 10 minutes, unable to restore even basic life support functions, while the rest of the fleet held position around them, weapons ready but with nothing to target. When power finally returned, restored as mysteriously as it had been taken, the crew reported no memory of the interval during which their systems had failed, a detail that sent a fresh wave of unease through every ship in our formation. I began to understand that we were not facing an enemy in any traditional sense. We were facing a demonstration of control so complete that resistance felt almost meaningless, a power capable of reaching into our ships and manipulating them however it chose, without ever needing to fire a single weapon or reveal its true nature. Admiral Threx's confidence, so absolute when we first crossed the border, had eroded into something closer to grim determination, a commander pressing forward, not because he believed victory was likely, but because retreat now felt just as uncertain as continuing onward. I flew my scout ship through the tense hours that followed with a growing certainty that whatever waited for us at the heart of this territory would answer every question we had, whether we were prepared for those answers or not. By the third day of our advance, the fleet had grown quiet in a way that unsettled me more than any alarm could have. Crews no longer chattered on open comm channels the way they had when we first crossed the border, exchanging jokes and idle speculation about what might lie ahead. Now every transmission carried a clipped, careful tone, officers speaking only when necessary, as though raising their voices might draw unwanted attention from whatever watched us in the dark. I understood the instinct completely, because I felt it myself every time I keyed my own comm system, a reluctance to disturb the fragile silence that had settled over our formation since the last system's failure. Admiral Threx ordered a full diagnostic sweep of every vessel in the fleet, hoping to identify any lingering effects from the mysterious power failures that had plagued our support cruiser the day before. The results came back clean across every ship, no evidence of tampering, no unusual code embedded in our systems, nothing to explain how our enemy had managed to disable and restore power without leaving behind a single trace. This absence of evidence troubled the engineering staff more than any damage report could have. A visible malfunction could be repaired, understood, guarded against in the future. An invisible intrusion that left no fingerprint offered nothing to work with, no defense to prepare, no lesson to apply going forward. I spent much of that day reviewing historical archives once more, searching desperately for any precedent that might help explain the situation we found ourselves in. I found scattered references to ancient conflicts involving species capable of advanced electronic warfare, technologies that could jam communications or disable weapons systems from a distance. None of those references came close to matching what we were experiencing. Jamming left detectable signatures. Electronic warfare left traces in a ship's logs, however faint. What we faced left nothing behind at all, as though the very concept of evidence had been erased, along with our missing crew members, and vanished hull sections. Vesa Orim contacted me during a quiet stretch of that third day, her voice carrying a weariness I had not heard from her before. She explained that the flagship's science division had begun compiling a theory based on everything we had witnessed so far, a theory that unsettled even the most experienced officers aboard the command deck. According to their analysis, the technology being used against us did not appear to function through any weapon system they could classify. Instead, it seemed to manipulate matter and energy at a level far beyond our current understanding, an ability to selectively remove, disable, or alter objects within a defined area, without triggering any of the detectable physical processes our sensors were designed to identify. I asked her what that meant in practical terms, and she paused for a long moment before answering. It meant, she explained, that our weapons, our shields, our entire defensive doctrine had been built to counter threats we understood, threats that obeyed the physical laws we had spent centuries studying and preparing for. If this new enemy operated outside those laws, or at least outside our current understanding of them, then everything the Ascendancy had learned about warfare across its long history might prove useless against them. I sat with that thought for a long time after our conversation ended, staring out at the stars through my cockpit window, searching for some sign of reassurance that never came. The fleet pressed onward through the following hours without incident, a silence so complete that it began to feel like its own kind of threat. I found myself almost longing for another sensor ghost, another brief glimpse of the vast shape our drone had captured, anything to break the oppressive stillness that had settled over our formation. When the silence finally broke, it did so in a way none of us anticipated. A message arrived on every comm channel across the fleet simultaneously, bypassing our encryption protocols as though they did not exist, delivered in a calm, measured voice that I recognized immediately from my own earlier encounter. The voice offered no threats and no demands. It simply stated a fact, delivered with the same patient certainty I remembered from days earlier. It said that our fleet had traveled far enough into claimed territory to warrant a final opportunity to withdraw, and that this offer would not be extended indefinitely. The message ended as abruptly as it began, leaving every ship in our formation in stunned silence. Admiral Threx convened an emergency assembly within minutes, and this time, I noticed something different in the room as officers filed in for the meeting. The confidence that had defined our command staff since departing Ascendancy space had all but vanished, replaced by a grim awareness that we were dealing with a power far beyond anything our doctrine had prepared us for. The debate that followed grew heated in a way it had not during previous assemblies. Several officers argued forcefully for immediate withdrawal, pointing to the message as clear evidence that our enemy retained the capability to escalate far beyond what we had experienced so far, and that continuing forward risked catastrophic losses for the entire fleet. Others, including Admiral Threx himself, argued that withdrawal at this point would represent an unacceptable admission of weakness, one that would embolden the humans and any other species watching our response to press their advantage against the Ascendancy in the future. I listened to both arguments with a growing sense of dread, understanding that whichever path we chose, the consequences would likely prove severe. In the end, Threx made his decision, one that I suspect haunted him for the remainder of his life, however brief that life would prove to be. He ordered the fleet to continue its advance, but with a modification to our approach. Rather than proceeding as a single unified formation, he split the Ninth Armada into 3 separate groups, each tasked with approaching the presumed heart of the claimed territory from a different vector, in the hope that dividing our forces might reduce the effectiveness of whatever technology our enemy used against us, while also increasing our chances of locating and engaging whatever command structure directed their operations. I was assigned to the group led by Vesa Orim, a smaller contingent of 11 vessels tasked with approaching from the northern vector, while Threx himself commanded the largest group advancing directly through the center of the claimed territory. The third group, led by a veteran officer named Kalik Dresh, would approach from the southern vector, completing a pincer formation that Threx believed would overwhelm any concentrated defense our enemy might mount. I had my doubts about this strategy from the moment I heard it explained, given everything we had witnessed about an enemy that did not seem to rely on concentrated defenses in any conventional sense. But orders were orders, and within hours, the 3 groups separated and began their divergent approaches into the unknown. Flying alongside Vesa Orum's smaller formation felt different from the larger fleet, a shift I noticed almost immediately. The crews aboard these 11 vessels seemed more attentive to each other, checking in across comm channels with a frequency that bordered on nervous energy, as though the reduced numbers made every ship's survival feel more personally significant. I found myself sharing in that heightened awareness, watching my sensor display with an intensity that left my eyes aching after only a few hours of continuous vigilance. Vesa maintained a steady, reassuring presence across our formation's comm channel, offering updates and encouragement in a tone that helped steady my own frayed nerves, even as I suspected she felt just as uncertain as the rest of us. 6 hours into our divergent approach, my sensors picked up something new, a faint energy signature unlike anything I had previously detected, pulsing at regular intervals from a point deep within the claimed territory ahead of us. I reported the reading immediately to Vesa, who confirmed that her own instruments had picked up the same signal. We adjusted our course slightly to investigate, moving cautiously toward the source while maintaining defensive formation in case the signal proved to be another trap designed to lure us into a vulnerable position. As we drew closer, the signal grew stronger, resolving eventually into a pattern that our communications officer identified as a structured transmission, though the content remained encrypted beyond our ability to decode. I remember the tension aboard our formation as we approached the source. Every crew member braced for the possibility of an ambush, weapons systems primed and ready, despite our growing understanding that conventional weapons might prove useless against whatever we were about to encounter. When we finally reached visual range of the signal's origin, what we found defied every expectation I had carried into that moment. There was no massive fleet waiting to ambush us, no hidden shipyard or fortress bristling with weapons. Instead, we found a single small structure, no larger than one of our own support cruisers, floating alone in the vast emptiness of space, its surface a smooth, matte black that seemed to absorb the light around it rather than reflect it. The structure emitted no visible weapons, no defensive systems that our sensors could detect, nothing to suggest it posed any threat at all beyond the sheer unsettling wrongness of its presence in a region we had come to associate with such profound danger. Vesa ordered our formation to hold position at a cautious distance while she attempted to establish communication with the structure. For several minutes, nothing happened. Our hails met with the same patient silence that had characterized every previous encounter with this unseen enemy. Then, without warning, the structure's surface shifted, panels sliding open to reveal an interior that pulsed with a soft, ambient light, unlike anything our own technology produced. I watched through my cockpit camera as a single small vessel emerged from within, no larger than my own scout ship, moving toward our formation with a grace and precision that made our own ships feel clumsy by comparison. The small vessel came to a stop roughly 100 meters from Vesa's flagship, and for a long, tense moment, nothing happened. Then, the same calm voice we had heard before spoke through our comm channels once more, addressing us directly this time, rather than broadcasting a general warning. It identified itself, in terms our translation systems struggled to fully render, as a representative of the human border authority, tasked with observing and, if necessary, responding to unauthorized incursions into claimed territory. It informed us that our fleet's continued advance, despite repeated warnings, had triggered a formal response protocol, and that this response would now proceed according to established procedure. I felt a chill run through me at those words, delivered with the same unsettling calm that had characterized every previous communication from this enemy. Vesa attempted to open a dialogue, explaining that our fleet sought only to understand the nature of the claim being made over this territory, that violence was not our intention despite our continued advance. The voice responded that intention mattered less than action, and that the Ascendancy's repeated dismissal of clearly stated warnings had already set a chain of events in motion that could not now be reversed through diplomacy alone. Before Vesa could respond further, the small human vessel simply vanished from our sensors, not destroyed, not retreating in any direction our instruments could track, but disappearing as completely and instantly as our missing scout ships had days earlier. The structure it had emerged from followed moments later, its panels sealing shut before the entire object faded from view, leaving our formation alone once more in the vast emptiness of space, staring at coordinates that now held nothing but stars. I remember the silence that followed, broken only by the quiet hum of our own ship's systems. Every officer aboard every vessel in our formation, waiting for whatever would come next, uncertain whether we had just witnessed a retreat or the opening move of something far more severe than anything we had faced before. The silence, following the disappearance of the small human vessel, did not last long. Within minutes, every sensor aboard our formation began registering activity across a wide area surrounding us. Faint distortions that flickered in and out of detection range, appearing and vanishing with a rhythm that felt almost deliberate, as though whatever surrounded us wanted to be noticed without ever being fully seen. Vesa Orim ordered our 11 ships into a tight defensive circle, weapons primed, shields raised to maximum capacity. Though I suspected every officer in our formation understood by now that conventional defenses had proven largely useless against this enemy. I kept my eyes fixed on my sensor display, watching the phantom readings multiply around us, dozens of brief distortions appearing simultaneously across every direction our instruments could scan. The pattern reminded me of something I had read once in an old survival manual, a description of how certain predator species surrounded their prey before closing in, using numbers and coordinated movement to eliminate any avenue of escape. I did not share this thought with the rest of the formation, unwilling to add to the mounting tension already evident in every voice crackling across our comm channels, but the comparison lodged itself in my mind and refused to leave. Vesa's voice came through steady and controlled, ordering our formation to hold position and avoid firing on any target unless a clear and confirmed lock could be established. I understood the wisdom behind this order, remembering how the larger fleet had wasted significant ordnance firing at phantom readings days earlier, but holding position, while surrounded by an unseen and overwhelming force, tested every instinct I possessed, as a pilot trained to react rather than wait. My hands hovered over my weapons controls, ready to fire the moment any target presented itself, though I suspected by now that no such target would ever fully materialize. The waiting stretched on for what felt like hours, but likely lasted only minutes, every second measured by the pounding of my own heartbeat against my ribs. Then, without warning, one of our formation's support vessels simply stopped responding to hails. Its position on our sensor display remained fixed, its hull intact according to every visual indicator our cameras could provide, yet every attempt to establish contact with its crew returned nothing but silence. Vesa ordered a nearby vessel to approach and investigate, and I watched with growing dread as the assigned ship maneuvered closer to the silent support vessel, its own sensors sweeping for any explanation of what had happened. The investigating vessel's report, when it finally came through, sent a wave of horror through our entire formation. The support vessel's crew had not been harmed in any way our instruments could detect. They simply were not there anymore. Every station aboard the ship empty, every system still functioning normally, as though the crew had simply stepped away from their posts and never returned. No blood, no signs of a struggle, no indication of what had happened to the dozens of people who had been operating that vessel only moments earlier. The ship itself remained perfectly intact, drifting in space like a hollow shell of what it had been. I felt my stomach twist into a knot as the implications of that report settled over me. Whatever force controlled this territory did not need to destroy our ships to defeat us. It could simply remove the people crewing them, leaving behind empty vessels that posed no threat and offered no resistance, a method of neutralization far more unsettling than any conventional attack could have been. Vesa's voice, when she spoke again, carried a tremor that had not been present before, and I understood that even her considerable experience had not prepared her for a threat operating so far beyond the boundaries of everything we understood about warfare. She ordered our formation to begin a slow, controlled withdrawal, abandoning our attempt to locate the source of the human presence in this territory, in favor of regrouping with the rest of the fleet. I felt a surge of relief at the order, though it quickly gave way to renewed dread as I realized withdrawal offered no guarantee of safety, not when our enemy had already demonstrated the ability to reach into our ships regardless of distance or direction. Our formation began its slow retreat, every vessel maintaining tight defensive spacing, weapons still primed despite the growing certainty that they would prove useless against whatever pursued us. 10 minutes into our withdrawal, a second support vessel fell silent, its crew vanishing exactly as the first had, leaving behind an intact but empty ship drifting among our retreating formation. Vessa's voice rose in volume for the first time since I had known her, ordering an immediate acceleration to maximum safe speed, abandoning the careful defensive spacing we had maintained in favor of pure distance from whatever hunted us. I pushed my own scout ship's engines to their limit, watching my sensor display with growing panic as the phantom readings around us seemed to multiply further, closing in from every direction despite our increased speed. I do not know exactly how many ships we lost during that desperate retreat, only that by the time our formation reached the rendezvous point where we hoped to regroup with the rest of the fleet, 3 more vessels had gone silent, their crews vanished, their hulls left drifting empty in the vast darkness behind us. Vessa's formation, which had numbered 11 ships when we split from the main fleet, now numbered only 6, a loss so severe that I struggled to process it even as I flew, my mind cycling through disbelief and terror in equal measure. When we finally reached the coordinates where Admiral Threx's central formation waited, the scene that greeted us offered no comfort at all. The central group, which had numbered the largest contingent of our divided fleet, showed similar losses, several vessels missing entirely from their expected positions, their crews' fates unknown though I suspected, with a sick certainty that they had met the same end as our own missing ships. Threx's voice, when it came through the fleet-wide comm channel, carried none of the confidence I remembered from the beginning of our advance, replaced instead by a weary, hollow tone that told me everything I needed to know about how badly our situation had deteriorated. He ordered an immediate consolidation of our remaining forces, abandoning the divided approach that had seemed so promising only hours earlier, in favor of regrouping into a single defensive formation. I guided my scout ship toward the coordinates he provided, watching as the remnants of our once proud armada gathered together, a fraction of our original numbers now clustered in a tight defensive sphere, every remaining vessel bristling with weapons that everyone aboard now understood would likely prove insufficient against whatever continued to hunt us through the darkness. As our formation consolidated, reports began filtering in from Calic Dresch's southern group, and the news proved no better than what we had already experienced. His formation had suffered losses comparable to our own, several ships vanishing without explanation, their crews taken exactly as ours had been. Calic's voice, usually steady and measured in every interaction I had witnessed, cracked slightly as he delivered his report, a small but telling sign of how deeply this campaign had shaken even our most experienced officers. Admiral Threx called what would prove to be one of our final full assemblies, gathering the surviving senior officers across every remaining vessel through a secure comm channel, since physical assembly aboard the flagship now felt too risky given everything we had witnessed. I listened to the roll call of losses with growing horror, understanding as the numbers accumulated that our once formidable Ninth Armada had been reduced by nearly half in the span of a single day, without a single confirmed engagement, without ever landing so much as a single shot against whatever force opposed us. The debate that followed carried none of the earlier disagreements about strategy or aggression. Every officer who spoke agreed unanimously that immediate withdrawal represented our only viable path forward, a complete reversal from the confidence that had defined our departure from Ascendancy space only days earlier. Admiral Threx listened to the consensus with a grim, resigned expression, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a commander who understood he had led his fleet into a catastrophe he could not have fully anticipated, regardless of how many warnings he had chosen to dismiss along the way. He ordered the fleet to begin a full withdrawal, retracing our path back toward the marked boundary as quickly as our remaining vessels could manage. I felt a fragile hope kindle in my chest at the order, a desperate wish that perhaps retreat now, however belated, might still offer some chance of survival for those of us who remained. That hope would prove short-lived, though I did not yet know it, as our diminished formation began its retreat, every remaining ship pushing its engines to maximum capacity, in a desperate bid to escape territory that had already claimed so much of what we had brought into it. Our retreat began with a fragile sense of order, every remaining vessel maintaining tight formation as we retraced the path that had brought us so deep into claimed territory. I flew near the center of our diminished fleet this time, no longer trusting the relative safety of the outer positions I had occupied during our advance, and I noticed similar instincts among the other scout pilots, all of us drawing closer to the larger ships, as though proximity alone might offer some protection against a threat that had already proven it could reach anywhere it chose. Admiral Threx maintained a steady stream of updates across the fleet-wide comm channel, tracking our progress toward the boundary with a precision that felt almost desperate, as though counting down the distance remaining might somehow accelerate our escape. I found myself watching the navigation display obsessively, calculating and recalculating the hours remaining until we would cross back into unclaimed space, clinging to that number as the only tangible measure of hope available to me in a situation that had otherwise stripped away every certainty I once held about warfare and survival. For the first several hours of our retreat, nothing happened. No phantom readings, no silent ships, no calm voice breaking through our comm channels to remind us of warnings we had failed to heed. I began to wonder whether our enemy considered the matter settled, whether the losses we had already suffered represented the full extent of the consequences for our incursion, and whether we might yet escape with the remnants of our fleet intact. That fragile hope shattered when Calic Dresh's voice broke through the comm channel, tight with barely controlled panic, reporting that 2 more vessels from his formation had gone silent within the span of a single minute. The pattern repeated across our retreating fleet, with a horrifying regularity, over the following hours, ships falling silent in 2s and 3s, their crews vanishing without explanation, their hulls left drifting empty in the vast darkness we struggled to escape. I watched our fleet's numbers dwindle on the tactical display with a growing numbness, unable to fully process the scale of what was happening, even as it unfolded directly in front of me. Admiral Threx's orders grew increasingly desperate, adjusting our formation repeatedly, in a futile attempt to protect our remaining vessels from a threat that seemed to strike wherever and whenever it chose, regardless of any defensive measure we attempted. I remember the moment I first considered that we might not survive this retreat at all, a thought that had lurked at the edges of my awareness for hours before finally crystallizing into something I could no longer push aside. Our fleet, which had numbered 42 vessels when we crossed the boundary, now numbered barely 20, and the rate of our losses showed no sign of slowing as we pushed toward what we hoped would be the safety of unclaimed space. I began quietly preparing my own scout ship for the possibility of an independent escape, checking my fuel reserves and emergency systems with a thoroughness I had never applied during routine operations, driven by an instinct for survival that overrode every consideration of fleet discipline or loyalty to my commanding officers. Vesa Orim contacted me privately during a brief lull in the chaos, her voice carrying an exhaustion that went beyond simple physical fatigue. She asked whether I had noticed the pattern in our losses, and when I admitted I had not fully considered it, she explained her observation with the careful precision of an officer determined to extract useful information, even from a catastrophe. Every vessel lost so far had been a support ship, a scout, or a smaller escort. Never one of our larger capital ships, never the flagship itself. She theorized that our enemy was deliberately targeting our fleet's ability to gather information and coordinate defense, isolating our larger vessels by stripping away the smaller ships that provided their eyes and ears across the battlefield. I considered her theory carefully, and the implications chilled me further than I thought still possible, after everything we had already witnessed. If our enemy operated with this level of calculated precision, targeting specific ship classes for specific strategic reasons, then everything happening to our fleet represented not chaos or random destruction, but a carefully controlled campaign designed to achieve a specific outcome with minimal excess force. I asked Vesa what outcome she believed they were working toward, and her answer arrived after a long, heavy pause. She believed they intended to strip away our fleet's ability to defend itself or communicate effectively, isolating our remaining ships before delivering whatever final action they had planned from the very beginning of this encounter. Her words proved prophetic sooner than either of us expected. Less than an hour after our conversation, every communication system across the fleet failed simultaneously, comm channels filling with static that no amount of adjustment could clear. I found myself suddenly isolated, unable to contact Vesa, unable to reach the flagship, unable to coordinate with any other vessel in our rapidly disintegrating formation. My sensor display still functioned, showing the positions of nearby ships, but without communication. Coordination became impossible, each vessel now effectively alone despite flying in close proximity to dozens of others. I watched through my cockpit window as ships around me began drifting out of formation, their pilots presumably attempting independent maneuvers without the benefit of centralized coordination. Panic began to seep into my own thoughts despite my best efforts to maintain the discipline my training had instilled in me over years of service. I pushed my scout ship toward what I judged to be the most direct path back toward the boundary, trusting my own navigation instincts, since no external guidance remained available to me. The vast shape appeared without warning, filling my forward viewport with a presence so massive that my mind struggled to process its scale, even as my eyes registered every detail. It was the same silhouette our sensor drone had briefly captured days earlier, now fully visible, close enough that no cloaking technology could hide it from direct observation. The vessel's surface bore the same matte black finish as the small structure Vessa's formation had encountered, absorbing light in a way that made its exact edges difficult to determine even at close range, as though the ship existed at the boundary between visibility and shadow. I froze at my controls, every instinct screaming at me to flee, while some deeper, more primal fear held me motionless, transfixed by the sheer scale of what floated before me. The vessel dwarfed our flagship by a margin that defied easy comparison, its hull stretching across a distance that would have taken several minutes for my scout ship to traverse at full speed. And yet, despite its overwhelming size, it moved through space with a silence and grace that felt almost unnatural, betraying none of the labored thrust signatures that characterized every vessel the Ascendancy had ever constructed. A voice broke through my cockpit speakers despite the total communication failure affecting every other system across our fleet. The same calm, measured tone I had come to recognize with a dread that now bordered on physical illness. It informed me, directly and personally, that my fleet's continued presence in claimed territory, despite multiple warnings and demonstrations of consequence, had exhausted the patience of those responsible for defending this border. It stated that a final response would now be initiated, and that any vessel wishing to survive should depart the region immediately, without hesitation, without attempting further resistance or communication. I did not need to be told twice. I pushed my scout ship's engines to their absolute maximum, angling away from the vast shape looming before me and toward the boundary that represented our only hope of safety. Behind me, I heard reports beginning to filter back through a suddenly restored communication system, voices filled with terror, describing similar massive vessels appearing throughout our formation, each one positioned near a cluster of our remaining ships, as though deliberately arranged to ensure no vessel could escape without directly confronting the scale of the power arrayed against us. Admiral Threx's voice broke through the restored comm channel, his tone stripped of every trace of the confidence he had carried at the beginning of our campaign. He ordered a full and immediate retreat, every remaining vessel authorized to break formation and flee independently if necessary, prioritizing individual survival over any pretense of coordinated fleet discipline. I did not need the order to know what I must do, already pushing my ship toward the boundary with every ounce of speed my engines could provide. But hearing Threx's voice crack with something close to genuine fear told me more clearly than any sensor reading could that our situation had moved beyond crisis into something approaching total catastrophe. I flew through the chaos of our fleet's final collapse with a focus so narrow that everything beyond my immediate flight path seemed to blur into meaningless noise. My scout ship's engines strained under the demand I placed on them, warning indicators flashing across my console as internal temperatures climbed toward dangerous levels, but I pushed onward regardless, driven by a survival instinct that overrode every other consideration. Behind me, through my rear sensors, I caught fragmented glimpses of the disaster unfolding across what remained of the Ninth Armada, vast dark shapes moving among our scattered ships, vessels falling silent in numbers too rapid to fully track. I heard Vessa Orum's voice one final time during that desperate flight, her transmission breaking through the chaos of overlapping distress calls flooding every comm channel. She informed me that her own vessel had sustained damage during an attempted evasive maneuver, though she did not elaborate on the nature of that damage, and her voice carried a strange calm that unsettled me more than panic would have. She wished me safe passage back to Ascendancy space, and told me to ensure that whatever happened to the rest of our fleet, someone survived to carry the full account of what we had witnessed back to those who needed to hear it. I tried to respond, to offer some word of encouragement or a plan for rendezvous, but her channel went silent before I could form a coherent reply, and it never reopened again. I do not know precisely how long my flight toward the boundary lasted, only that it felt like the longest stretch of time I had ever experienced, every second stretched thin by fear and the relentless focus required to keep my failing engines from tearing themselves apart under the strain I demanded of them. My sensor display showed the boundary marker drawing closer with agonizing slowness, and I found myself bargaining silently with whatever forces governed luck and survival, promising anything, if only I could reach that line, before whatever hunted our fleet caught up with my own small vessel. A massive shadow passed close enough to my ship that my entire cockpit trembled from the proximity. Though no direct contact occurred, no weapon fired, no beam or projectile crossing the distance between us, I risked a glance through my side viewport and caught a full, unobstructed view of one of the vast vessels that had haunted our fleet since our first encounter with this territory, close enough now that I could make out details I had never managed to capture through my sensor drone days earlier. The hull bore no visible weapons, no gun ports or missile bays of any kind that I could identify, and yet the sheer scale and silent power of its passage told me everything I needed to know about why our fleet had proven so utterly unable to defend itself against this enemy. I did not slow down to study it further, pushing my engines past every safety threshold my training had ever taught me to respect, desperate to put distance between myself and that silent, watching presence, before it decided my survival was no longer permissible. The boundary marker grew larger on my display with each passing second, and I allowed myself a fragile flicker of hope as the numbers indicating my remaining distance continued to shrink, even as reports of continued losses crackled through my comm channel from other surviving pilots, scattered across the retreating remnants of our fleet. I crossed the marked boundary at a speed that strained every structural component of my scout ship, engines screaming in protest as I finally allowed myself to ease back on the throttle, my entire body shaking with a combination of exhaustion and residual terror that I had not fully processed during the desperate flight itself. I looked back through my rear sensors, half expecting to see the vast shape pursuing me even across the boundary line, but found only empty space behind me, the vessel that had passed so close moments earlier already gone, vanished back into whatever hidden depths it called home. I did not stop to celebrate my survival, understanding with a grim clarity that many others from our fleet had not been so fortunate. I began scanning for other surviving vessels, hoping to establish contact with whatever remained of our once proud armada, and over the following hour, I managed to raise contact with only 6 other ships, scattered across a wide area of space just beyond the boundary, each pilot reporting similar experiences of desperate flight and narrow escape. Admiral Threx's flagship was not among them, and repeated attempts to reach him yielded nothing but silence, a silence that told me everything I needed to know without requiring confirmation. Calic Dresh's voice eventually reached me through a relay, established by one of the surviving support ships, his tone hollow, with the particular exhaustion that comes from having witnessed something no amount of training could have prepared him for. He confirmed what I had already begun to suspect, that Admiral Threx's flagship had gone silent during the final stage of our retreat, its fate unknown though presumed lost, along with the vast majority of the vessels that had once comprised the Ninth Armada. Of the 42 ships that had crossed into claimed territory with such confidence only days earlier, fewer than a dozen had managed to escape back across the boundary, a loss so catastrophic that I struggled to fully comprehend its scale, even as I sat among the scattered survivors, alive but forever changed by what we had witnessed. We gathered our surviving vessels into a loose formation and began the long journey back toward Ascendancy space, moving cautiously, watching our sensors obsessively for any sign that our enemy intended to pursue us, even beyond the boundary they had so clearly marked and defended. That pursuit never came. Once we crossed back into unclaimed space, the phantom readings ceased entirely, the sense of being watched that had haunted every hour of our incursion finally lifting, replaced by an emptiness that felt almost as unsettling in its own way, a stark reminder of how completely alone we now were, stripped of the vast majority of the fleet we had once commanded. During the long journey home, I found myself replaying every moment of the campaign in my mind, searching for some point where a different decision might have altered our fate, some warning we might have heeded more seriously, some strategy that could have preserved more of our fleet against an enemy so far beyond our understanding. I found no easy answers, only a growing certainty that our failure had been rooted not in any single decision, but in the fundamental arrogance that had led us to dismiss a clear and simple warning in the first place. an arrogance born from centuries of assuming that superior numbers and conventional military doctrine would always prevail against any threat we encountered. I thought often, during those quiet hours of travel, about the calm voice that had spoken to me during my very first encounter with this territory, delivered without anger or malice, simply stating a fact that we had chosen not to believe. "You were told not to come here." I understood now, with a clarity that had cost the lives of thousands of crew members across dozens of vessels, exactly how much weight those simple words had carried, and how completely we had failed to appreciate the restraint that had characterized every step of this encounter, right up until the moment our continued defiance had finally exhausted whatever patience our unseen enemy had extended toward us. Our small group of survivors reached the nearest Ascendancy outpost roughly 2 days after crossing back over the boundary, our scattered formation of 7 remaining vessels, a mere fraction of the proud armada that had departed only a week earlier. I remember the expressions on the faces of the outpost's personnel as we docked, confusion quickly giving way to alarm as they realized how few ships had returned, and how badly damaged and depleted the crews aboard those ships appeared to be. Word of our catastrophic losses spread through Ascendancy space faster than any official report could travel, carried by whispered rumors and hushed conversations among personnel who could not quite believe what they were hearing. I was summoned before the High Council within days of our return, along with Kalik Dresh and the handful of other surviving officers who held sufficient rank to offer testimony about what had occurred. I stood in a chamber I had only ever seen from a distance during formal ceremonies, addressing counselors whose expressions ranged from skepticism to barely concealed horror, as I recounted every detail of our encounter, from my initial solo scouting mission to the final desperate flight that had brought me back across the boundary alive, while so many others had not survived. The counselors questioned me extensively, pressing for details about the vast vessels I had witnessed, the nature of the technology that had disabled our ships and removed our crew members without any conventional trace, the exact wording of every warning we had received before our fleet's catastrophic losses began. I answered every question as thoroughly as my memory allowed, though I could offer little in the way of concrete technical explanation for what we had experienced, having witnessed capabilities that fell so far outside the boundaries of our own understanding of physics and warfare, that I struggled even now to fully articulate what I had seen. A younger counselor, one whose name I would later learn was Muriel Kassin-Vosk, pressed me on a particular detail that the others had glossed over during their questioning. She asked whether I believed the humans had shown any indication of pursuing our fleet beyond the boundary they had claimed, or whether their actions suggested a purely defensive posture limited strictly to the territory they had marked as their own. I answered honestly, explaining that once our surviving vessels crossed back into unclaimed space, every hostile presence had simply vanished, with no attempt made to pursue or engage us further, a detail that seemed to carry significant weight for several counselors present in that chamber. Over the following weeks, as the Ascendancy's intelligence apparatus worked to compile a fuller picture of the disaster that had befallen the Ninth Armada, additional information emerged that placed our own encounter within a far larger and more troubling context. Reports began surfacing from other species across the region, testimonies describing remarkably similar experiences with the same territory, the same calm warnings dismissed, the same catastrophic losses suffered by fleets that had chosen to press forward regardless. Every account followed an almost identical pattern: a measured warning offered, a period of escalating demonstration when that warning went unheeded, and finally a devastating response that left surviving vessels shattered and scattered, their crews decimated without a single confirmed instance of direct combat ever having taken place. I found myself invited to a private meeting with several members of the Ascendancy's Strategic Command, officers tasked with compiling a comprehensive analysis of the human threat, based on every available fragment of evidence gathered from our own campaign and the accounts of other affected species. During this meeting, a senior analyst named Oren Kesk-Halvard presented findings that painted an unsettling picture of the technology we had encountered, theorizing, based on the patterns of our losses, that the humans possessed some form of matter manipulation capability that operated on principles far beyond anything currently understood by any species catalogued within the Ascendancy's extensive records. He explained that the complete absence of debris, the total lack of detectable energy signatures during every incident of ship or crew disappearance, and the consistent pattern of restraint followed by escalation all pointed toward a civilization operating with a level of technological sophistication that dwarfed anything the Ascendancy had encountered during its long history of expansion. He cautioned the assembled officers against underestimating this threat further, noting that our own campaign had demonstrated with brutal clarity the consequences of dismissing clear warnings simply because they came from a species whose military presence remained largely invisible to conventional observation. I asked him directly, during the closing portion of that meeting, whether he believed the Ascendancy should attempt further contact with the humans, whether diplomacy might succeed where our military incursion had failed so catastrophically. His answer, delivered with the careful precision of someone who had spent weeks studying every available fragment of evidence, suggested that any future contact should proceed with extreme caution, respecting the boundaries the humans had clearly established, rather than testing them further through any show of force. He believed, based on the consistent pattern observed across multiple species encounters with this same territory, that the humans showed no interest in expansion or conquest beyond their claimed borders, seeking only to be left undisturbed within the space they had marked as their own. The High Council ultimately issued a formal directive following weeks of deliberation, establishing the human-claimed territory as permanently restricted space, forbidden to any Ascendancy vessel, regardless of circumstance or apparent necessity. The directive carried unusual weight for a diplomatic decision, backed by detailed accounts of our fleet's destruction that were distributed throughout Ascendancy military command as a cautionary lesson for every officer who might otherwise consider testing similar boundaries in the future. I contributed extensively to the documentation supporting this directive, determined to ensure that the sacrifice of so many crew members from our fleet would at least serve the purpose of preventing similar catastrophes from befalling other Ascendancy vessels in the future. In the months that followed, I returned to active service, though my role shifted significantly from scouting and reconnaissance towards strategic analysis, a position that allowed me to continue studying the fragments of information we had gathered about the human threat, while contributing to broader Ascendancy policy regarding contact with unknown or technologically superior species. I often thought back to that first solo encounter, drifting powerless in my scout ship, while a calm voice informed me that I had been warned not to come here, and I came to understand that moment as a turning point not just in my own career, but in how the entire Ascendancy approached its relationship with species whose capabilities remained largely mysterious to conventional observation. I learned, through continued intelligence gathering over the following years, that other galactic powers had begun quietly adopting similar policies regarding human claim territory, each civilization arriving independently at the same conclusion the Ascendancy had reached through such devastating cost. The human border, once dismissed as an empty bluff by commanders convinced of their own superiority, had become something closer to a universally respected boundary, marked not by visible fortifications or patrolling fleets, but by a quiet, consistent reputation for catastrophic consequences that awaited anyone who chose to test its resolve. I never learned the full truth about what technology the humans actually possessed, never gained access to any detailed explanation for how they managed to disable our ships and remove our crew members without leaving behind a single trace our sensors could properly analyze. Perhaps that mystery was intentional, a deliberate choice by a species that understood the power of the unknown, allowing fear and uncertainty to accomplish what direct confrontation might have made unnecessarily costly for both sides. Whatever the reason, the lesson had been learned, carved permanently into the collective memory of the Ascendancy, and countless other species who now gave that region of space the wide and respectful berth its inhabitants had asked for from the very beginning. I still fly on occasion, though never near that boundary, never tempted to test whether the restraint we witnessed during our catastrophic campaign might extend a second chance to those foolish enough to seek one. I carry the memory of that campaign with me always, the silence of empty ships, the calm voice delivering warnings we chose to ignore, the vast, dark shapes moving through space with a grace and power that no conventional fleet could hope to match. We were warned. We did not listen. And an entire armada, 42 proud vessels crewed by thousands who trusted their commanders to lead them wisely, paid the price for that single, catastrophic failure to simply believe what we had been told from the very beginning.